Good afternoon, folks, and thanks for coming out. For once, we are really grateful to have a tent here. Usually, other days it's been hot and sun beating down on the tent has been kind of warm under. But today it's really nice to have a tent. There is a couple chairs in the middle. Yet, for if you want to leave your chairs, there's a couple in the middle there. There's some room on the end here too. Room for a couple way on the other end. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Is there bulletins? We haven't got.
Oh, you haven't got one yet? Oh. Where are they?
Scott, where are you?
There he's at. Marlon will get a few bulletins here.
We don't care if the last row gets water.
Yeah.
I'll get him. You're the showmaster. I'll get him.
Yeah.
There you go, Scott.
Well, it's a good crowd, and I hope we'll answer the question by the end of the day. Why are there so darn many churches in the Norway Lake area? We'll find out, I hope. Okay, I think there's plenty of bulletins, so if we need more out here, why?
We can use some of last year's too if we need.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll start, and the first thing on the program is the singing of the two national anthems. Gene Urban will play for us, and the flags are out here behind us. We can't see them, but you know where they are. So we'll start with the Norwegian national anthem, and it should be on the song sheet. Yeah, stand. Please stand if you can. Ja, vi älskar detta landet som det stiger fram. Guldet värdet över vannet med 1000 järn. Älskar det jag tänker på vad far och mor. Och den saga natt som sänker drömmer på vår jord. Och den saga natt som sänker drömmer på vår jord. And the Star Spangled Banner. Flag is out this way.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you very much. You were terrific. Peter, you got more choir members here. That's a very nice rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. Okay, what's next on the program? I think we go directly to the program. And Marlon Henjum will introduce it and call on the speakers as they should come forward.
You bet.
Thank you, Earl, and thank all of you for coming this afternoon. It's always questionable, it seems like these last few years, when you wake up in the morning, what the weather's going to be, but it looks like we're going to survive. So I might want to direct your attention to the bulletin, and there's a little diagram in there that's probably going to help you follow what it is we're talking about. It's how the Lutheran churches in this area kind of developed. Just a simpler way of looking at it. What I'm going to do is introduce our panelists, which are scattered around. First speaker will be Kurt Mankel, who will follow my introduction. And Kurt is son of the famed local historian Orland Mankel, the guy who really deserves that title. And Kurt has been really interested in doing a lot of local research and so forth. He has a little bit of Swedish blood in him, but we've so far accepted that because he has also Norwegian blood. Second speaker today will be Jeffrey Johnson, who's kind of the spark of our organization, probably because he's younger than many of us. But he's also the spark of many other organizations in this county, too. So you'll hear from Jeff, and then next you're going to hear from our full-fledged Swede, Eloise Nelson. She was accepted originally because she's married to 100% Norwegian, Carlton Nelson. So that helps. But she's been our treasurer now for many, many years. And the final speaker will be Jane Huseby Norman, who tends our website, if you ever refer to that or look into it, and does a fabulous job of that. So those will be the people you'll be hearing from. I had a question at lunch this morning. There were two people there that I didn't expect to see that I graduated from high school with, and I think Ed had probably encouraged them to attend services here this morning. One was Jerry Kaiser, who lives in Sombroda, Minnesota, and the other was Reverend Ray Larson, who was in our class and was a pastor at Hope Presbyterian in Spicer for several years. And Ray asked me, "Marlon, why are there so many churches at Norway Lake?" And believe it or not, I told him in about 10 minutes. So if we get too windy here, we can always revert to that procedure where instead of getting the full load, you just get a partial load. But their questions related, you've all heard them. You've heard questions about why are there? Which one is it? I know you go to church at Norway Lake, but which one is it that you really go to? We know for years there have been examples of weddings that were delayed, funerals that were delayed because family and mourners couldn't find the church. Fortunately, GPS was invented, and now we don't have as much of that problem. I never heard of a case where the deceased didn't get to the church, although there was one time when a funeral director from Minneapolis was trying to find a church out here. They made it in time, but it was just in the nick of time, so it happens. Some of the questions we receive is, why is East Norway Lake, that's one Ray asked me today, why is East Norway Lake west of Norway Lake? See, seems like a logical question, doesn't it? And he said, so if First Lutheran and East Norway Lake are in the same parish, surely East Norway Lake must be east of First Lutheran. Well, no, I said it's a little west, in fact, and mostly south. Or some people might ask you, surely West Norway Lake must be west of East Norway Lake. Well, yeah, a little bit, but it's mostly north. Ray's question today was, why aren't there any north or south Norway Lake churches? Good question. Some people get west, they say there are two West Norway Lake churches. No, there aren't. There's West Lake Church, named after West Lake, and West Norway Lake, named after Norway Lake. So people get confused. And then the big question we all have heard at one time or another is, why in the world are you people at Norway Lake always fighting about church? We celebrate lots of 150th anniversaries this year. New London just finished a major recognition of their 150th year. It also marks the end of the Civil War this year. And in this fall, on November 19th, will be the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Congregation at Norway Lake. That was the first formal organization of a church here. And from that one church sprang all the others that you see in your bulletin. I learned that lesson early on. I grew up on a farm on the Henjum farm on north side of Henjum Lake. And on that farm, there's a hill that's got to be one of the highest points in Aug16th Township. I learned a number of things on that hill. I learned, number one, a cultivator, the rear end of the cultivator does not always follow the front end of the cultivator, and probably dug up some corn hills. Plus, I learned that when you're hauling a full load of hay, don't go down the hill. I mean, put it in the lowest gear you can and don't step in the clutch. But I also learned from there that I could see churches. I could look to the north, and up in the Sunberg Hills was a steeple, which was the West Norway Lake Church steeple. I could look straight east, and I could see the East Norway Lake Church, where my great-grandfather was buried. And I can look a little bit north of that, and I can see the First Lutheran Church of Norway Lake, where my grandfather joined when he married a girl from that church. Otherwise, I'd be an East Norway Lake member today, I suspect. Then I could turn around, look west, and a little bit north, mostly more north than west, actually. That was Westlake Lutheran Church. And if I'd been as old as my grandfather or my great-grandfather, there would have been yet another steeple out there, and that would have been the Hauge Church, or Nannested as it's called, which stood a mile south of the intersection of County Road 5 and County Road 40. By the time I was born, that church was, well, actually, it was still there, but when I was 2 years old, it was tore down. So, how did all these churches come from one to so many? We're going to let Kurt take it from there. Kurt.
Grab this. All right, so I'm going to go back even further than what Marlon started at with the first congregation here at Norway Lake. There's an interesting history of all the churches before that. So here's what I'm going to talk about: the New Sweden congregation, which is kind of a new name to some of you. So I'm going to talk about it from 1859 to 1862, which includes Norway Lake. Then I'm going to talk about the Dakota War era, and I'm going to talk about the first part of the Norwegian Church era from 1865 to 1866. So the New Sweden congregation was formed on July 22nd, 1859, was the first congregation in the area, and it was called New Sweden. Peter Carlson was the first pastor. Included local Norwegians and Swedes from Eagle Lake, Ness Lake, Lake Prairie, which is now Crow River, and the Norway Lake areas. So this is officially part of the Scandinavian Evangelical Lutheran Church Synod of Northern Illinois. That was the official membership at that time. Augustana, which some of you are somewhat familiar with, wasn't created until 1860, and that's considered the Swedish church. So here's the church constitution from July 22nd, 1859. So this was written by the first settlers that came to Monongalia County, which was the northern half of Kandiyohi County. And at the very top it says Eagle Lake, Monongalia County. It's actually spelled wrong, July 1859. So here's the translation, and I think it's very interesting. You don't have to read it all, I'll just repeat it here. As we Swedish and Norwegian people have located in this vicinity and expect to make our future home, and as we realize that in our new home is to be truly congenial, our people must continue God-fearing, and to foster this requires the preaching of our gospel clear and undefiled, and with proper administration of the holy sacraments. We Swedes and Norwegians desire to unite in organization of the Scandinavian Evangelical Lutheran Congregation, which the Lutheran faith shall be adopted and acknowledged. Signed, Reverend Peter Carlson. So note the unity of the Swedes and Norwegians at that time. On July 1861, Andrew Jackson was elected pastor. He was a local Swedish immigrant who later became a minister. In July 1861, they were organized into parishes. There was the New Sweden Parish, which is Eagle Lake and Ness Lake, the Lake Prairie Parish, which is now Crow River, and for the first time ever, something called the Norway Lake Parish. Again, this is part of the New Sweden Church. This is the first time Norway Lake is used in any official documentation. The first church was actually the Andrew Hole's cabin, which is on the east side of Long Lake. A membership at that time was 103 at the New Sweden Parish. Lake Prairie was 55 and Norway Lake was 45. And I think roughly it's about half Swedish and half Norwegian. It was reorganized again where the New Sweden Parish was divided officially into the Eagle Lake and Ness Lake parishes. So is this new information? For some of you, this is new. For me, it was new. I didn't know about this, but this is kind of like rediscovered history. It's just something that we've kind of looked at again. And I went back going, well, gee, why didn't my dad know this? Well, it turns out he knew it very well. And he wrote about this in 1983 and actually published it in the church newsletter. So we had this information before. So here's the oldest. I contacted the Augustana College, which is in Illinois, and they have the oldest New Sweden documents I could find. It's incomplete, unfortunately, but this has the oldest record saying Norway Lake, November 1861. Way at the top up here it says 1861, and this is the marriage record where it says Johannes Lundberg, and over here it says, you can barely read it, but it says place of marriage celebration, Norway Lake. So that's the first time that name appears. So here's a map of the area from an Augustana Synod history book called A Church is Planted, and it shows the different parishes at the time. Here we are right here. Here's Norway Lake. There's Green Lake over there. It says Norway Lake Parish, 1862, Lake Prairie Parish, Eagle Lake down here, and Ness Lake. So here's the site of the first church, first New Sweden church. It's actually on the east side of Long Lake. That sign actually is there right on the Long Lake Road. So this is again Andrew Hole's cabin. So here's the first path. Here's Andrew Jackson and his wife. They actually met at Beckville, which is a Lutheran church near Litchfield, which I actually have a connection to. That's my mother's maiden name was Jordine, and that's where her family initially came from. So Pastor Jackson was born in Sweden in 1828. Last name was Dahlin. He came to the U.S. as a sailor in 1852. He deserted 2 ships and changed his name to Jackson to not be tracked. Because Jackson doesn't sound too Swedish, does it? It's kind of like Davidson or Clarkson. So that's how the name Jackson came here. He worked in Illinois. He was a bartender in New York City and a teacher in Wisconsin. So he kind of got all over the place. He came to Monongalia County in 1859, and he was ordained pastor in 1861 in Chicago. Here's a little point that kind of gets overlooked. In the spring of 1861, Jackson met Little Crow, Chief Little Crow. Dakota Indians had a camp at Henderson Lake, and an argument erupted over a pig between the settlers and the Dakota. And Jackson kind of helped negotiate so this didn't get too out of hand. But he became concerned about what was going on here, that there was a bigger issue than just a pig. So he actually wrote to Governor Ramsey, and Ramsey sent some soldiers to camp at nearby Twin Lakes, which is just maybe a half mile or a quarter mile to the south, east of Henderson Lake. So the reason I mention this is because Jackson was also involved in the tragic events of 1862 in the Norway Lake, Munson Lake areas. Just a really quick side note, The commander of the soldiers at Twin Lakes, he was Major John Pemberton, U.S. Army. 2 years later, he was surrendering 33,000 soldiers at the Battle of Vicksburg. He was now a Confederate, and that's him on the right, wearing a gray uniform. So I just thought this was a very interesting point. So now back to Monongalia County. Now the Norwegian church arrives. Pastor Moose, Bent Julius Moose, of the Norwegian Synod, visited here in 1860. He actually was at Lake Prairie. He organized the first congregation there in 1861. July 1862, Moose had a service at the Christopher Engen home near Norway Lake. So now we have Moose and Jackson in the same area. They're kind of competing against each other. So here's Moose, born in 1832 in Norway, went to the University of Christiania, which is Oslo, became a pastor in 1859, was a pastor all throughout southern Minnesota. He founded St. Olaf College in 1874. So not a minor person here. But he was a dissenter in the Norwegian Synod. He was kicked out in 1898, and he was described as being very uncompromising. He moved back to Norway after he was kicked out. He had some health problems, had some strokes. He died in 1900. He's actually buried in Trondheim, Norway, and here's a picture of his grave. So now I'm going to talk about what I'm just going to call the catastrophe, 1862 to 1865. You know, what happened to here and what happened to the settlers. And so the Swedish Munson Lake settlement was attacked by Dakota on August 20th, 1862. Attack happened right after Pastor Jackson finished a service at Munson Lake. He was on his way to he went to do a service in Norway Lake. He didn't tell anybody about the attack yet. He delayed it. He knew about the attack he knew about the attack at Acton on August 17th, but he didn't tell anybody. So then the Norway Lake settlers fled, and they wound up in St. Francis, Minnesota, which is closer to Anoka than St. Cloud. Sometime later, people stayed in Mahnomen, which is now Fridley. Pastor Moose kept in contact with the exiles at St. Francis, and he visited them. So I think that's kind of a key point for the future of the Norwegian church. By 1863, Pastor Jackson was actually president of a school that became Gustavus Adolphus College. So he's kind of out of the picture. So here's Mahnomen. I took this picture a couple years ago. This is the Mississippi River and Rice Creek on the left. The families who stayed there were the Osmundson family, Engen family, and the Morgan family, who were my relatives. I have some documents that state they were there October 1863. Here's a building that still exists in Mahnomen. It was an inn, store, and post office in 1862, so it's very likely that the settlers stayed here. So now I jump back to Norway Lake, 1865 to 1868. The exiled settlers returned and the new immigrants arrived. The Norway Lake settlers never restarted the Norway Lake parish of the New Sweden congregation. There's no record as to why they didn't. Pastor Torgerson was pastor in the summer of 1865. He visited the area. He's part of the Norwegian Synod. Pastor Thomas Johnson was pastor fall of 1865 to 1866. These weren't official pastors. These were just kind of visiting, passing through the area at the time. So here's the key date Marlon mentioned a little bit ago. Settlers met at the house of Andrew Hedin, November 19th, 1865, and that's now Jericho. A Lutheran congregation officially organized, but with no constitution. The Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church in Norway Lake was its title. The current churches we will detail today are traced to this congregation, and again, as Marlon mentioned, it's 150 years ago. Here's where it gets a little confusing. January 1866, Andrew Hedin donated some new land for a church. This is the donated property is the present-day East Norway Lake Church in Jericho. The congregation realized they couldn't keep meeting in homes and they needed a new church. So at the time, the Hedin property was considered too far away from the center of population. So the congregation looked for a new alternate location. And that's where in 1866, it was decided to build on this site we're sitting at now, on land donated by Ole Knudsen. The Articles of Incorporation were drawn up summer of 1868. Pastor J.C.T. Moses became pastor in August 1868, along with the Crow River congregation. And so the log church was completed in 1868. And here's the letters of incorporation, or document of incorporation. So I want to go backwards and just, you might ask, well, what happened to the Swedes? There was no longer a Norway Lake Parish in the New Sweden Church after 1862. The Norway Lake settlers organized with the Norwegian Synod. However, there were new incoming Swedes to the area that did come to the log church, and those happened to be my ancestors, the Mankel family. They were pretty hardcore Swedish, but they came here, I think, just because it was purely a practical, close location. The nearest log church was, or the nearest Swedish church in the 1860s was the Ness Lake Congregation Log Church. That was part of the New Sweden congregation that kind of restarted. And that was built near Bear Lake. So you had the Ness Lake Church built near Bear Lake. Wow. And I realized after writing this that everybody navigates around here by names of lakes, even if they're wrong. But I think it was called the new Ness Lake Congregation, so they just kept the name. So Swedes did start other churches, like Mamerlin Lutheran, Salem Mission Covenant, which was Lutheran first, the Lake Florida Mission Covenant, which was also Lutheran first. In fact, here's the official name in 1870, just to give you my last bit of Swedish propaganda. Swedish Evangelical Lutheran Church of Norway Lake. At Lake Florida. Yep, that was the official name. They changed it a few years later to say Lake Florida, but that was the first official name. So it was the first Lutheran church in Lake Andrew Township. There was also the Swedish Methodist Episcopal, which was, I believe, north of what is now Highway 71, west of Highway 71 on a hill right north of 40. That was the first location. And I think they moved that to Colfax around 1900. There was also the Lumby Covenant Church, which I know nothing about. The Ness Lake Congregation, which was originally part of New Sweden, that became Lebanon Lutheran in New London. And that's now Peace Lutheran. So here's the conclusions. Just to, if you take away a couple things out of this, it's the first Norwegian and Swedish settlers were more united than thought. At least that's my impression. Divisions amongst people kind of came later, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. And the really key date for the first congregation connected to the current churches is November 19th, 1865, as Marlon said. That's 150 years ago this fall. So that's what I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Kurt. I suspect there may be questions, but I think we're going to keep going, and maybe we'll, if there's time and we aren't rained out by the time everybody's done, we can answer some questions. We thought it originally when we heard Kurt's research, I personally called it blasphemy, but I've since learned that sometimes you have to accept the facts. So Kurt brings us up to the point where the log church here has been built. And how many people were there this morning, Ed or Earl?
About 60.
About 60. Was it full?
Well, there were 25 out here.
The 25 out here, so it was kind
Quite full in
of, okay, but it wouldn't be too many more and it would have been full.
Yeah.
Okay. The population of Norway Lake Township, in Norway Lake Township at that time was not Norway Lake Township as it is today. It was Norway Lake, Colfax, Lake Andrew, and Arctander townships. The population that time in 1870, 2 years after the church was built, was 141 families comprising 669 people, or average family was ma, pa, 2 kids, and 1 on the way. So if everybody decided to come to church one Sunday with 669 people living in the area, it would have been a problem. Jeff is going to tell us how they solved that. And listen carefully, because now we get to why east is east and west is west. And
Yeah, but there's a lot of steeples out here. You already heard Marlon talk about that a little bit. Thanks, Marlon, for that intro. I appreciate that very much. So we're going to answer this question. Why are there so many Lutheran churches here in Norway Lake? Some even wonder if they got the same pastor or whether or not they're from the same synod. So let's see how many we can name. You got, as Marlon said already, West Lake, Munson Lake, West Norway Lake, East Norway Lake, First East West, First West East, and then there's a few others that have come and gone. Spring Creek is no longer there. Sunburg Free Lutheran, just because they have lake in the name, isn't really the catcher. Most of the time they shared the same pastor. So we talked today about a 6-point parish, and we think of what they did in those days. You'd get on your ox cart in the morning and you'd ride for 2 days to get all your services done. It was not so long ago that the question at Ladies' Aid might have been asked of my great-grandmother, Vel prølerigstad, hvorfor tror du det så mange Lutherkirker runt Norge Lake? In other words, did you realize that as recently as 1932 they were still only speaking Norwegian at the services here? In fact, in 1930, there was only 3 services that were, in the entire year, there were only 3 services that were done in English. Everything else was in Norwegian. So I've got good authority why there is more than one Lutheran church here. And it goes back to a sailor named Lars. Lars came from the old country and he was sailing his Viking ship across the sea, and he shipwrecked and pulled right up on shore and crashed, and there he was, all by himself on this deserted island. There was no My Girl Friday or nothing there, just him and his axe. And about 3 years later, along came a ship blown off course by a vicious northeast wind, and that ship came and pulled up to the shore, went to fetch him up and carry him off the island, and the captain and the purser and first mate got off, and they're walking around, and Lars rather was so proud of himself, and he was showing them his smokehouse and his hut and his running water system that he had put in. And they looked over and there were 3 steeples on the horizon right on this little tiny island. And he said, Lars, you must really be a devout person to have all these churches. Were there somebody here before you got here? No, he says, the one over there, that's the one I used to go to. And this one over here is the one I go to today. So while I wasn't able to visit with any of the people that were here when this church was formed back in the 1860s, we'll realize that the information that we use comes from the church histories. And one of the things that I'd like to encourage you all to do is realize these are the words of the writers of these histories. And hopefully it'll give you a bit of an insight and say, I'd like to go back and dig out that Hope Lutheran history, or the one from East Norway Lake, and read some of the stories that are in there, because there's a lot of very interesting things there. So the first church in the area is here where we're at today, and that was the log church. 1862, soon after the original settlers came, there was probably a shout over by Halvor Halvorsen, and it was probably that forward-thinking racehorse operator named Evan Railson, and he probably hollered out, "Ta med riffeln, må vi resa till Crow River och överbevisa dem om att vi må ha en kyrka här på Norge Lake. Kanske vi kan få dem till att betala för en pastor också. Grab your rifle, we must travel to Crow River." And convince them that we need to have our own church over here and we need to use your pastor. So off this self-appointed committee of 2, Halvor Halvorsen and Evan Railson, they traveled their 12 miles up the road, and they were headed off to Crow River. And you can see where the churches were located. You can see all these gold spots on the map. Those are all the current churches that are there today. All those steeples that Marlon talked about. So they traveled all the way up from right here is about where Evan Railson was, and they had to travel all the way up here. Oop, let me turn my pen on. They traveled from here all the way on up, all the way up here to Crow River. Oh, it's right there in yellow, see? And so they traveled all the way up to Crow River, 12, 13 miles to try and talk him into sharing a pastor. Well, that didn't work so good. They traveled from right over here by County Road 40 and Little Crow Trail. That's just about 3 miles east of here. Because right about that same time, got to be August, and Kurt's already talked a little bit about the Dakota Uprising. So by 1865, some of the original folk that had settled here earlier, some had started to return, some never did come back. And by that time, Reverend Thomas Johnson, one of those itinerant preachers that was traveling around the country, came all the way from Nicollet, which is 100 and some miles to the south, and baptized 2 children that day in November, 19th of November in 1865 at the Engen home. And that was the same day that they signed the Articles of Incorporation with Christopher Engen, Evan and Anders Railson as the Board of Trustees. They didn't have a lot of money in the congregation, so they figured we don't need a treasurer today. We can always appoint one later. But they did adopt that resolution that says, "We, the Norwegian settlers at Norway Lake, have come today to the conclusion that our church and cemetery should be located on Arthur Hedin's land in Section 13 of Arctander Township," which, of course, as Kurt said, was over here where the current East Norway Lake Church is. Mr. Hedin, he had pledged 2 acres of land if the church was only willing to pay for the deed. Now, they thought that was a pretty done deal, but not nearly as done quite as fast as Railson's horses were, because there was other things that were happening in the community at the time. What was that? The 1862 Homestead Act had been signed just 3-4 years previous to that time, and settlers were moving in here quite rapidly. Remember, Marlin said there was 600 and some residents in the area. Well, a lot of them didn't settle on this side of Sundberg. They settled to the west, all the way out towards Spring Creek and towards Swift Falls. And as a result, there got to be a real consternation. Should we build a church where Hedin had given us that land? And there was a vote, and they decided, no, we better not. That's a little too far west. We've got to appease our family members and our friends living to the west. So they decided to build here on Ole Knutsen's donated land on his high ground, looking out across Knutsen Lake. There wasn't a lot of money in the area. Didn't have a lot of cash, but they were still really, really concerned that there wasn't enough churches in the area. So they built here instead. Everyone was supposed to contribute logs. Well, that only worked until they had to start cutting them down. And then there wasn't quite enough logs to go around. And right now you look across the horizon and you see all these trees. Well, you got to think back, 1865, the only trees you had were located right here along Knutsen Lake. So if they needed an extra log or 2 logs or 3 logs to build a church, Ole Knutsen would go out and you have to cut some more and bring logs up. And they continued to work until they got everything built. Crow River, if you remember Crow River, they'd been there earlier to see about using a pastor from Crow River. They finally agreed that, yep, by golly, we can do this and we can have the parsonage at Norway Lake, as long as the residents of Norway Lake each pay $25 a head to maintain the parsonage. Crow River wasn't so silly. They knew what they were doing. I'm not sure who got the better end of that deal. But luckily for them, at that time, Pastor Lars Marcus was hired as the pastor here. And the lucky part was the fact that he was a bachelor at that time, and he lived with Evan Railson. So as he didn't have to pay for a parsonage, so he didn't have to build one at that time, which is a good thing. And the other thing that was kind of interesting about that resolution, it stipulated that at that time in 1869, the pastor shall furnish all of the communion bread, and Evan Railson shall furnish the wine, and every communicant shall pay the pastor a nickel every Sunday morning. And they still had a debt to pay on the construction costs, and they were pretty sharp in those days. So in 1872, they decided everybody's got to pay their fair share, and so they assessed everybody a fair share of what was still owed on the church, and made everyone sign a note and pay 10% interest on that note till they got the loan paid off in the fall. So the church basically borrowed from everybody, told them you're going to owe this much money, and then by fall you need to pay us off. And 2 families couldn't afford to do that, and so they weren't allowed to come to church. Can't pay, can't play, and made them stay home. And then eventually Evan Railson borrowed them the money. We don't know how much interest he charged, but he stepped up and borrowed the money so that they could begin attending church again. More and more settlers are moving into the area west of Sundberg. Remember, Sundberg was incorporated about 1872. So it wasn't too long before even the log church was no longer in the center of the parish. And in 73 or 74, they voted to decide, should we build a new church or should we move someplace else? And so they voted, and they still voted, 53 to stay here and 21 to build new. So there's 53 in favor, 21 again moving. They were pretty thankful. They had just staved off another split of the congregation. But that was only for a little while. They just had a little bit of relief, and then we had to move on. this was not a viable solution. By the end of the year, they realized that these families in these outlying areas were not coming into church. And outlying would mean Sunburg. It would mean west of Sunburg 2 miles. You got to remember, how did they get around? Ox carts and horse and buggy, and they walked. There weren't Model A's or Model T's yet at that time. And the fear was, and what prompted them to do something, was there's these families in these outlying areas were being ministered by non-Lutheran pastors, Episcopalians and Methodists and Catholics. And we can't be having that. So we're going to have to do something about that. So a solution had to be found. They passed another resolution in 1875. The east portion, they met and agreed that we need to build a new church, and we'll build that on the Hedin site, which is where the current East Norway Lake Church is. And that's now called Jericho. At that time it was called Jericho. Maybe even have a picture if we move on here a little bit. This is Pastor Marcus. Here's the East Norway Lake Church. Oop, one more. There's the East Norway Lake Church and the creamery at Jericho. So in 1875, they built a new church. Well, they agreed to build a new church. It's going to be 56 feet long and 34 feet wide and 18 feet tall. And think about that, 18 feet tall, and it stood all these years fighting those northwest winds. There, of course, just like every other congregation, they had their issues. There were a number of them that thought, if we make the church 10 feet shorter, we can save $65. And the whole church is going to cost $450. So they could save about 12-13% if they made it 10 feet shorter. Luckily, there were enough bigger thinkers in the congregation that said, if we got a plan for growth. And so they did, and they built it at the full size. They hired their engineer. They brought an architect. They got their material in St. Cloud, and they built it in 1875. At that meeting in 76, Pastor Marcus proposed a resolution that the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church of Norway Lake shall be divided into 2 congregations, which shall be called East and West Norway Lake congregations, and that both of these shall have an equal share in the parsonage. This resolution was adopted. The parsonage was located where Phil and Carolyn Hattlestead currently reside, down on the curves on the Norway Lake grade. And soon after, the original log church was moved to the parsonage site. And I may have misspoke. There's 2 parsonages. There's the new parsonage for First Lutheran, and that's where they built up the first East Norway Lake parsonage. And then they built another one where Phil and Carolyn live. This church building here was moved down to where Phil and Carolyn currently live. Back at that time, the log church had been open for 10 years. There were 490 baptisms held in this log church building in 10 years. 142 confirmations, 72 marriages, 77 burials, and 125 church services. So while this was going on, and remembering that Crow River was still part of this parish, you have to still look to the west. Look to the west end of Monongalia County to see what was going on out there, to the log church. Because remember, Log Church was, at that time, had just got done being the only church in the area. They just built a new East Norway Lake Church. Most of them figured it was important, but they also thought they had to educate the children. And because they wanted to be able to bring them up, and they figured if the children were reading the Bible, they weren't out carousing and carrying on. And so they had parochial school, and at that time, schools didn't run so long. So every year they voted, and they decided to have parochial school in the spring after public school closed for 2 months. So they had 2 months of parochial school in the public school buildings. No separation of church and state in the 1870s. They also was a young people society organized in 1908 that had 76 members. They raised money and similar to the Ladies' Aid. And when the new basements were needed in the church, they each contributed funds for that as well. So once the East Norway Lake Church was built, they decided we needed to build one by Sunburg. And that was done on land that was owned by Thor Paverud. That's where the West Norway Lake Cemetery is today, which is just this side of 104. Now it's County Road 7. That also cost $450. That's probably because it looks a lot like East Norway Lake. They might have had the same engineer. Now, if you go back to one of the pictures, it'll show hundreds of people lined up at the dedication when they dedicated that church. That first service was held in November of 76, but they didn't have a name yet. They weren't going to name theirs until they found out what the East Norway Lake named theirs. So we'll wait. And by 1877, they incorporated it as West Norway Lake, and that was part of the Synod Samfund. This was a time when farm families were having a tough go of it. Price of wheat was down, wasn't raining enough. Bugs, lots of bugs. It was said that in 1877, the grasshoppers are so thick that you couldn't put your foot on the ground without squishing at least 4. And it's similar to the locust infestations in Salt Lake City. But even then, they were still, even though the farmers weren't making a lot of money because the bugs were bad and the drought was bad, they were still proud of their new churches. So they said, in order to showcase them, we're going to hold the Synod Assembly will be held here at East Norway Lake. And they did that in 1877. They had 27 pastors, 64 lay delegates, and 81 honorary members came here for a whole week and stayed. Now, where do you suppose they stayed? There wasn't a Holiday Inn. And there wasn't a Northern Lights in Spicer. So where'd they stay? They stayed at the homes of all the people that lived here, all those 600 people that Marlon talked about earlier. And back to the ladies, they had to help out again. Certainly was a trying time. By 1883, East Norway Lake had 641 members, and West Norway Lake had 700. More and more the conversations turned to how they can afford to make payments on everything. And so they had to figure out ways. Sometimes they just donated their crop or a portion of their crop. By 79, Crow River had left. Crow River pulled out of this parish and joined up with Big Grove and Bruton, which left Norway Lake by themselves. So Norway Lake had to hire their own pastor. And now Pastor Marcus only had East Norway Lake and West Norway Lake parishes. West Norway Lake was large and continued to grow. And it grew to the west. So by 1897, there was even a creamery out at Spring Creek. They processed 4,700 pounds of milk a day, and they had big dreams. That Spring Creek Creamery was going to, at one point, they figured they could make cheese for half the state of Minnesota. Yeah, that was in 1897. By 1926, they closed the creamery down. So it didn't. Some things don't pan out as well as you think. By 1906, they had to build another church, and that's where they built Spring Creek Church. Another nice church out in that area. That now became a 3-point parish. So you had East Norway Lake, West Norway Lake, and Spring Creek. And the first pastor there was Reverend Suttendahl. He served in those parishes for about 20 years, and a lot more changes occurred in the beginning of the 20th century. In 1920, they decided to sell the existing parsonage that was just east of the Brick Church, which is where the first Lutheran parsonage was, right in the curve, not Phil's, but there's a newer house where my niece lives. And they sold that, and they built the new parsonage for East Norway Lake, West Norway Lake, and Spring Creek. They had to have it centrally located, and they built that parsonage in Sunburg. And that's there. So this was the parsonage in Sunburg that was built to serve all 3 parishes. That house is still there, and right now it's owned by the Rosenbaum family. In 1923, calamity strikes. Reverend Sottendahl passed away. As an interim was hired for a period of time, and by 1924, Herman Balson had moved there as the pastor. He was known for his fluency in both Norwegian and English. Remember now, they were still speaking only Norwegian up until 1930, or just starting to speak English. And he had a lot of energy, a good voice. He helped to make this transition from Norwegian to English. During the later part of his career, until he left in 1947, he did his services. His sermons were both in English and Norwegian every day, every Sunday. So now, instead of coming to church for 1 hour, you'd have to come to church. Let's see, each sermon's about 20 minutes long or 30 minutes long. We're going to have 2 of them, And no getting out of that, because Norwegian was still the language of choice yet. Many of our parents, your parents, certainly only spoke probably Norwegian or Swedish until they got into grade school. In 1926, the decision was made to put a basement underneath the church at East Norway Lake, and they even got electric lights. They bought a generating plant at Mickelson's Hardware in Sunburg and carried it out to East Norway Lake and got power. Something else I thought was pretty interesting, they didn't even have offering plates until 1932. Just imagine if that's the way it is today almost. Now everything wants to be direct deposit. Well, they were way ahead of their time. So in 1932, now we're going back to that. They also had a budget committee, and that time it was called a Ligningskommittee. And this committee had a lot more responsibility than you have today at your budget committees at church, I'm sure. Because then you'd look at each family and determine, based upon how their soybeans looked or how their wheat crop was, how much could you afford to contribute to church. And then once you got done doing that, you'd tell them, I think you need to contribute 13 bushels or 3 cows or a pig or whatever it might be, based upon what they thought you could do. Of course, then they had to go around and collect, too. Can you imagine? No one would be on the budget committee anymore, I don't think. So history's starting to repeat itself. Pastor Froyland, who I remember when I was going to West Norway Lake when I was a little kid, he was here from 57 until 63. That wouldn't have been 18, that'd be 19. 63. But one of his responsibilities, one of the tasks that he was assigned by the synod, was to figure out a way to reorganize the churches in the area and get Sunburg Lutheran and West Norway Lake and Spring Creek and East Norway Lake and get them all to be one church. And now we're kind of getting back to that again. He didn't have very good luck. 1947, after Reverend Balson retired, they hired a new progressive pastor. And he was pretty much an evangelist. And his style didn't sit so good with the folks up at West Norway. They were a little more conservative than that. And so they decided they're going to pull out, which they did. And they left the parish. So now you had East Norway Lake over here, and you had Spring Creek way over there. And in between was West Norway Lake, and they had to get their own pastor. And then Pastor Marcus served East Norway Lake and Spring Creek both. So now on Sunday morning you'd leave there, and you'd have to ride horseback 15 miles to Spring Creek to hold the next service. So that was kind of a trying time. They were still remodeling even in those days. The big thing in the 40s was these new wood blocks. Now, new wood blocks, if you look at East Norway Lake on the ceiling, there's these look like paper acoustical tiles on the ceiling. Well, they were put in the early 40s, both there and West Norway Lake and several others. That was a big thing at that time, these new wood blocks. Now they say they got asbestos, but they really don't. They're made from sawdust. And West Norway Lake, they put in the speaker systems in 1948. Spring Creek continued to grow. And they stayed with East Norway Lake until 1963. And now you can see there's a picture of what Spring Creek looks like today. It's just a little miniature and a marker, but it's still a real pleasant place. The cemetery's still there yet, and that kind of gets to where we're at with the churches today. But one thing, any discussion on churches is incomplete unless you talk about what? The Ladies' Aid. Absolutely, the Ladies' Aid. At West Norway Lake, they formed the Ladies' Aid in 1886 by Pastor Felsted. And when they met, he came in and he'd play the organ or he'd play the piano, and they'd sing songs. But their main reason for being the name Ladies' Aid, Navan Ladies' Aid, was because they were going to help out the poor. And the poor, the indigent in our society. So each had to pay dues. They paid dues of 10 cents. There's a picture of the Ladies' Aid there. 10 cents a meeting. By 1888, they had enough in their budget that they were able to buy the organ for the first church at West Norway Lake for $300. And they met. And when they'd meet, they'd have meals. And the meals became more and more festive. Now, how do you picture this? You got these stoic Norwegians, short and frugal, and they were having these festive Ladies' Aid meetings. The hostess had to provide, and I quote, bread and butter, lefse, meatball, salmon, sauce, and cake, along with cookies and coffee. And you had to have 2 kinds of each dish, except for the butter. And Reverend Felsted, he heard one day to say that it's just too bad you can't find 2 kinds of butter also. It didn't take the women very long, though, to figure out this is a lot of work and a lot of expense, especially when their whole business was to provide for the poor. So at Spring Creek, they actually passed a resolution in 1932 that if you got caught making too much food, we're going to charge you. We're going to charge you $1 fine if you serve more than 1 kind of cake, more than 2 kinds of sandwiches, more than cookies or donuts, pickles, and coffee. If you had any more than that, then it was going to cost you $1. But that's how they paid for things. So by that time, the membership of the Ladies' Aids had gotten so large that they separated into various circles or districts. And they helped with lots of things. Basements, the organ, the kitchen, most of the decorating. 1948, they changed their name to the Missionary Guild. They put in new colored windows at the old sanctuary. And this is the old sanctuary at Spring Creek in 1948. It cost $2,060. Just think of how many fines they must have been assessing to get that $2,060. Quite involved, these ladies were. So you can see that the East and West Norway Lake and Spring Creek congregations, spanning a distance of nearly 20 miles, were really born out of a need to have a convenient place to worship. They had their ups and their downs, they had their fights and their carrying on, and they still do this. You know, it still goes on. West Norway Lake was demolished in 83. They built a new church in Sunburn called Hope Lutheran. They've sold their second parsonage, and now all that remains of West Norway Lake is a cemetery up in the Churchwoods. Steeples are still on the horizon. But remember what I said about the trees not having any around? Now the trees are actually growing taller than a lot of the steeples. And I'm not so sure if Marlin, now that he's gotten just a little bit older than he was driving that cultivator down the hill, would be able to see the same steeples as we saw before. So, thank you.
You know, to be honest with you, some of them didn't have steeples back when I saw them, so, but you could still see East Norway Lake and First Lutheran. East Norway Lake maybe did at that time, but I know First Lutheran didn't. Isn't it interesting how tough it is to stay awake when there's something rain on the roof and you've got a full stomach? It's tough, isn't it? Anybody want to stretch? I know those chairs aren't the easiest to get out of either. And we also realize that there's an important event at East Norway Lake Church at 3 o'clock that involves a number of you, so we don't want to run late, or I understand that goes till 6 o'clock. So also, remember, we have bathroom in the interpretive center, so at any time, if you feel the urge, please go ahead and visit. Otherwise, we'll move on if you'll bear with us. Jeff was showing off his Norwegian a little bit, I noticed. I don't know if he translated it for us or not, but I have a Norwegian phrase too I want to share with you, and I know some of you will know what it means. But here it is. Ingen strid som kirkestrid. I see some people smiling. Ingen strid som kirkestrid. There's no fight like a church fight. So that's what we're going to talk about now. There's an old story. I don't think it was necessarily, I got to stand up straighter, Ole and Lena or anything, but the two rural travelers, if they were traveling through an area and they saw two painted frame churches, preferably across the street from each other, they were pretty safe to be in a Norwegian settlement. And that was true here, although one of the churches wasn't frame, it was brick, and the others were frame. But I'm going to talk, before Eloise starts, I'm going to review just a little bit about that period in our history. Joel News wrote, if you haven't read it, you should, wrote an excellent section in the First Lutheran Church history, and he titled it Storm Clouds Gather, and it covers this period that I'm going to talk about a little bit. And he cites four main reasons why the Troubles developed back in the 1880s. And from that Kirkestrid out here, we added two more churches. That's what it amounted to. The first thing Joel wrote about is, it didn't affect this area because it dealt with Seventh-day Adventists being in some areas of the country, and there was a disagreement and argument about honoring the Sabbath. And that really didn't affect us here, so I'm not going to talk about that at all. Second reason was related more to the Civil War, which began in 1861 and concerned the issue of state secession and slavery. Most pastors of that day received their training at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, which was run by the Missouri Synod. Even the Norwegian pastors from here were trained in that seminary because there was no Lutheran seminary yet at that time. Missouri, anybody who's familiar with the map is much closer to the south than what Minnesota is. And so the Missouri Synod took the position that slavery was okay for the states to secede from the Union, and that slavery was acceptable with God or in the Bible. The Norwegian Synod took a different position. They said there are some times when rebellion is necessary, but in this case, they didn't feel the states had the right to secede from the Union. And the Norwegian Synod felt that slavery was, while it was mentioned in the Bible, should not be legal and was certainly an evil thing. So you had this conflict developing, which kind of ended, of course, when the Civil War came to an end in 1865. But it probably left some hard feelings among the people at that time. The third reason was a more serious one, I think a more realistic one. And trouble developed because I think it had a lot to do with the role and authority of the pastor. In order to understand this, we have to compare how the churches in Norway were run with how it worked in the U.S. Norway had a state-run church, and it was the Lutheran Church. There were no other churches. One of the founding principles of the United States was separation of church and state to avoid discrimination and persecution of religious groups. In Norway, the pastor had a lot of authority and was in some ways considered a local official. If any of you have done family history and you've tried to determine when your ancestors left Norway, it'll be in the parish records where you find the specific date that they left the country. And it was up to the Lutheran pastor in the parish to make a record of that. The Lutheran pastors in Norway were paid by the government. Some of our ancestors quickly learned when they arrived in the U.S. that seeing a pastor was kind of a hit-and-miss affair. There may have been a pastor who traveled through the area infrequently to preach, baptize, marry, bury, and burials, of course, could not wait for the pastor, so oftentimes a layperson stepped in, and once the pastor came around, he would bless the deceased and make it official, I guess. And as Kurt has already talked about, building churches in rural areas became a competitive thing. It was like some of the pastors were like salesmen selling soap and whatever else, and they were competing with each other. The Norwegians were competing with the Swedes, and the Swedes were competing with the Norwegians, because they knew they had to win the hearts and minds of the people to get them to join their churches. Unlike Norway, they had to win over the settlers and keep them happy in order to get paid. Big difference. In America, church membership was voluntary and based on democratic representation. They elected their leaders. This likely gave some of the early Norwegian farmers more courage to speak out and oppose the pastor if they disagreed on something. That could prove troublesome for the pastor, and it did occur here at Norway Lake. And I think most of you probably over the years, in different situations involving church, have run into cases where congregation members have not been bashful about saying certain things to the pastor. Pastor Idstrom can probably testify to that too, from personal experience. But that was, I think, one of the reasons that made it cause some of the conflict. The fourth and final reason is the most important one. Without getting into too much detail, it had to do with the theological concept of election and predestination. Some professors and theologians at the St. Louis Seminary began to promote a more Calvinistic interpretation of who will go to heaven and who will go to hell. A protest group developed and was called the Anti-Missourian Brotherhood. The protesters and theologians began to choose up sides. That we've seen too, if you've been involved in the church for a number of years. That often happens. People choose up sides. As the controversy grew, it soon involved the pastors at the congregational level, including Norway Lake and its pastor, Lars J. Marcus. Reverend Marcus, along with several prominent Norwegian Synod leaders, had signed a document in support of the Synod. By 1885, when the controversy burst into open warfare at Norway Lake, that's probably a strong word, but Reverend Marcus had been here for 17 years. Now, if you think about that, he was the first real parish pastor they had, and he had been here for 17 years. Taking my great-grandfather as an example, Pastor Marcus married him to Ingeborg Skinlund in 1870. He baptized 8 of their children, buried 3 of them, as well as Hans's sister, Britta Fasager. And this was true of many, many families, that he had had an impact on their life. Joel News writes in the First Lutheran History that Marcus took a moderate stand and encouraged his members to not act in haste. Nonetheless, a meeting was called on June 8, 1885, with an anti-Missourian pastor in attendance. The opposition to Marcus even requested that a minister from the other side of the argument be present at the meeting, and he was. The end result of the meeting was that a motion was made to fire Reverend Marcus for false teachings and unfaithfulness in the performance of his office. The vote was 40-11. You know, we talked about 669 people in 18, but Jeff mentioned some votes too. There weren't a lot of people voting, it was only men, of course, at that time. But apparently there was a lot of them that either were inactive or maybe didn't show up for meetings. The minutes do not record those not voting nor those absent from the meeting. It's important to note here that the parish pastor at the time was often asked to mediate disputes or disagreements. I think that could have been a big part of it too. You know, if there was a conflict between 2 people in the congregation, they often turned to the pastor for a decision or a suggestion how to resolve it. Well, it's not good being put in that position, because however you decide, you're going to irritate somebody with your decision. So that caused some conflict too, I'm sure. The disgruntled party, no doubt, also had sympathetic friends and neighbors. The anti-Missourian faction then denied Marcus access to the church, which he disobeyed. Do you have your cartoon, Jeff? That's pretty good. So they changed the locks on the doors. The minority group and Marcus entered the church anyway, whereupon the majority showed up and physically carried Reverend Marcus out of the church. A sad ending to what had been. That's a poor cartoon, but that's kind of a depiction of it that appeared in the pamphlets that circulated out here back at the time. A sad ending to what had been a successful ministry at Norway Lake. Less than 6 months later, Lars Marcus died on December 19th, 1885. His funeral was held at East Norway Lake Church that he had served so long, and he was buried in the church cemetery with his son, who had died only the year before. Lars Marcus was only 43 years old and was survived by his wife and 4 young children. Now, here is Eloise with the rest of the story, and keep in mind that the majority she's talking about are those who stayed in the church, and the minority are those who left to start their own church. Eloise. You probably want this in here.
And you all realize that I am the minority, being Swede. What I will try to do here is talk about, just do a chronological summary of the history of the first East Norway Lake Evangelical Lutheran Church, which is known as First Lutheran now. Following the events leading up to the end of 1885, and with no hope of unity within the majority and minority groups of either East Norway Lake or West Norway Lake congregations, they still had hope of an agreement in regard to the division of property, meaning the church building and the parsonage. However, they were unable to come to any agreement, and in January of 1886, the minority decided to seek legal action in regard to property rights. In March of 1886, Pastor Rigg, who had been an associate of Pastor Marcus, he left, and the minority no longer had a pastor. They were served for several months by Pastor Christopher Peterson, who was a son of Nils Peterson and uncle of Walter Peterson, and Pastor Estrom. In April of 1886, there was a meeting of the East Norway Lake trustees and a minority committee to discuss the division of property. Both parties agreed to the proposal presented. However, neither the majority nor the minority of East and West Norway Lake congregations agreed to this proposal. In October of 1886, Pastor Johannes Halvorsen was installed by the minority. He moved into the parsonage, as the minority had maintained possession of the parsonage after Reverend Marcus's death. Worship services were then held in the parsonage. This is for the minority people now. In March of 1887, the jury trial continued concerning property rights, whereby it was decided that the majority was the rightful owners of both the church and parsonage. The verdict was appealed to the Minnesota Supreme Court by the minority, but their efforts failed. In June of 1887, at the Norwegian Synod annual convention held in Decorah, Iowa, delegates of the minority groups of the East and West Norway Lake congregations were seated and recognized. Because of this, both First East and First West Norway Lake churches became known as the Synod Church. In April of 1890, after the final court decision, Pastor Halvorsen was evicted from the parsonage. The congregation then rented the farm home of Thomas Osmundson for Reverend Halvorsen to live in. In November of 1890, Pastor Halvorsen accepted a call to Minneapolis, which left the minority without a pastor or a church or a parsonage. However, they were determined to call a new pastor, build a church and a parsonage, despite their small number. Reverend C.N. Peterson was called to serve as temporary pastor, and the minority were permitted to use the Nanestedt Church for services. The original minority group included family names of Raelson, Halvorsen, Nelson, Torsen, Nygaard, Lesterberg, Larson, Blum, Lundemo, Peterson, and Reese. Descendants of several of those families continue as active members today. In 1891, the congregation decided to build a church on 15 acres of land purchased from Evan Raelson at $15 an acre. Raelson had been a staunch supporter of Reverend Halvorsen and the Norwegian Synod. The building committee members were Lars Nelson, Johannes Halvorsen, and of course Evan Raelson. They determined that $2,800 was the amount needed to build the church, which the group did raise that money, and construction began in the spring of 1892. On May 9th of 1892, Reverend D.C. Jordahl was installed at South Lake Johanna to serve the parish, which included First East Norway Lake, First West Lake, or Munson Lake, and South Lake Johanna and the Kirkoven congregations. Reverend and Mrs. Jordahl took up residence in the basement of the new church, where they continued to live until the parsonage was built. The church basement was also used for the parochial school beginning in January of 1893. Severin Hatlestad was the main teacher in the Norwegian boarding school from the years 1903 until it closed in 1924. The relationship between the rival congregations became more peaceful during this time. Organizations that served members from both congregations harmoniously included the Public School District number 69, the Norway Lake Band and Choir, and the Norway Lake baseball team. But they didn't go to church together, but they did these other things together. In 1894, the congregation was incorporated under the name of First Lutheran Church of East Norway Lake and remained a member of the Norwegian Synod. On July 11th of 1897, the church was dedicated and was led by Professor Vilskar, and about 1,200 to 1,500 people attended the dedication. In 1898, a decision to build a parsonage was voted upon and approved, and that was to be done by November of that same year. And by early 1900, it was paid for. A barn was also built besides the parsonage. In 1903, and during these years, financial difficulties persisted. Subscription lists were a new concept for the Norwegian immigrants who were accustomed to the state church's financial obligations. But in 1908, things were looking better, and a great celebration was planned to recognize the 50th anniversary of the first settlers who came to Norway Lake. The celebration was held on Johannes Halvorson's farm in the grove south of the lake. Old pioneers who were not members of the church were invited to attend. In March of 1913, Reverend Jordahl left for Ridgway, Iowa. After 21 years of dedicated service, Reverend Jordahl left a well-organized and growing parish that was struggling to survive when he arrived. The 1914 Synod annual report listed 604 baptized members and 406 confirmed members of the parish, consisting of Munson Lake, South Lake Johanna, and First Lutheran congregations. Now I'll talk a little bit about the News years. We all know about Reverend News, who served here at Norway Lake for so many years, from 1913 to 1953. Nils J. News emigrated from Norway to America in 1891 at the age of 15. He taught religious school at First Lutheran Church, Norway Lake, in the winter of 1900. He enrolled at Luther Theological Seminary in St. Paul that same year and was ordained into the Lutheran ministry on June 10, 1903 at Decorah, Iowa. He was called as a home mission pastor to Roseau County, Minnesota. Despite the many hardships he faced while serving several congregations in Roseau County, Reverend News established 4 new congregations and served as spiritual leader for as many as 12 congregations at one time. Another interesting note here, Pastor News didn't have an automobile then yet either. He traveled mainly by horse and buggy. And Roseau County is a huge county in northwestern Minnesota, and so he put on many, many miles every week going from congregation to congregation. Reverend News married Ellen Torgerson on September 20th, 1905. They lived in the cabin he had built on his homesteaded tract of land near Greenbush, Minnesota. Reverend and Mrs. News served the Lutherans in Roseau County until 1909, at which time he accepted a call to a multiple point parish at Landa, North Dakota. He served that parish until March 1913, when he arrived at Norway Lake. During this time, Reverend News wrote the Pioneer Pastor booklet, which we do have some copies available. I think Marlon talked about that earlier.
No, I didn't. $5.
$5. You can have a copy of this. It's a wonderful read. In March of 1913, Reverend News was installed as pastor for the parish, consisting of Munson Lake, South Lake Johanna, and First Lutheran churches. In 1916, a publication was written on the history of the Norwegian Lutherans at Norway Lake. The pamphlet was a joint effort by Reverend News and Reverend Suttendal of the East Norway Lake congregation. They worked harmoniously together, Pastor News and Pastor Suttendal. A 50-year celebration of the Norwegians' first organized Lutheran church at Norway Lake was held at Ole Knutsen's Grove. The festivities were held July 2nd through 4th for 3 days in 1916. Local and visiting ministers spoke, and old living settlers were provided seats on the platform and invited to respond. Those who spoke included Ole Knutsen, E. Glesney, Eric Paulson, Hans Pedersen, Mrs. Nels Peterson, Johannes Halvorsen, Ole Halvorsen, and Peter Broberg. In 1917, 3 Lutheran church bodies established the the Norwegian Lutheran Church of America. In 1918, a merger attempt originated with Reverend Suttendal's West Norway Lake congregation and was brought to the annual meetings of the congregations in 1918. Many members thought that the time was right for the parish realignment to reunite East Norway Lake and First East Norway Lake congregations. Committees were appointed for the purpose of meeting together and to comprise a proposal to rearrange the parish and determine ownership of the parsonage. The merger attempt was unsuccessful, but revealed that First East was the title holder of the parsonage grounds. Arrangements were then made to sell Munson Lake and South Lake Johanna congregations each a 25% ownership in the parsonage. This arrangement then continued for the next 45 years. Also, during the newest years, some things that happened. The Sunday school was organized in 1932. And in 1942, at the annual meeting of the congregation, they officially changed the name of the church to First Lutheran Church of Norway Lake. That's a whole lot easier to say, isn't it? And then in June of 1942, a festival celebration marking the 80th anniversary of the first church service at Norway Lake. Reverend Newis was the principal author of the 80th anniversary festival history book, and that was about the history of First Lutheran and Munson Lake congregations. And on June 25th of 1944, an important event occurred at First Lutheran Church with the ordination of Joel Newis, son of Reverend Nels Newis. On June 21st, 1953, there was a farewell for Reverend and Mrs. Newis after 40 years of faithful service to the Norway Lake area. And then on December 4th in 1954, women were granted the right to vote. Reverend Newis was largely responsible for this change, which gradually evolved over many years, beginning in 1915, when non-Norwegians desired to become members of the congregation. The change from Norwegian language to English also evolved during this time. Then substitute pastors served the congregations until Pastor Mellum was installed. In 1954, the congregation voted to build a new parsonage, which was completed upon the arrival of Pastor Mellum in July of 1956. In September of 1963, the realignment was approved for a new parish consisting of East Norway Lake and First Lutheran of Norway Lake congregations. The parish arrangement with South Lake Johanna and Munson Lake with First Lutheran ceased at this time. Pastors who have served the Norway Lake parish during the past 50 years include Reverend Fred Hagen, Ronald Jensen, Ronald Burke, Alan Björklund, Irving and Joyce Sandberg, Robert Kempinen, and Wayne Kopitsky. Much interest was beginning to surface as to the need of a new church in the mid-1970s. During this time, many members believed that the two congregations, meaning East Norway Lake and First Lutheran, should merge and form one congregation. The merger vote took place June 19, 1974. The effort to merge failed once again. This decisive vote would prove to be the deciding factor determining the events that were to take place during the next 10 years. The possibility of building surfaced at the annual meeting for First Lutheran on January 25, 1979. A committee was appointed to research this idea. A special meeting was held in September of that year, at which time the committee explained different alternatives regarding the building needs. Many members of both congregations felt that this would be the time to merge and build one new church. After several merger votes were taken, no such plan passed at both congregations. And so in May of 1981, First Lutheran passed a resolution to begin a building program. A building task force was appointed, and building plans progressed rapidly. On May 29, 1983, there was a groundbreaking for the new church. Another attempt to merge the two congregations in June of 1983 failed, laying to rest the merger discussion for the foreseeable future. June 10th, 1984 was Transition Sunday, when the move from the brick church to the new church building was conducted. On June 17th, 1984, Pastors Irving and Joyce Sandberg took place. Pastor Joyce was the first woman pastor at Norway Lake, just 30 years after women were granted the right to vote. And then on July 6th of 1984, the old brick church was demolished. In May of 1986, First Lutheran established a trust fund, and the trust committee continues to oversee the memorial and perpetual funds today. In 1987, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America was formed by the merger of three church bodies. In January of 1990, there was a committee appointed to study the need for additional space for Christian education. The education edition was completed in 1995. In 1992, the Keeping the Faith, Sharing the Faith history book was published in conjunction with the 130-year anniversary of the First Lutheran Church service held in the Norway Lake community. The project was led by Reverend Joel News. The new history book included a list of all pastoral acts as recorded in the church record books for the years 1865 through 1991. Baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and funerals are listed in the history book. Now, a little bit about East Norway Lake. Since the realignment with First Lutheran that formed the Norway Lake Parish in 1964, East Norway Lake celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1975, at which time they added a new front entrance to the church building. The anniversary history book was also published as part of their celebration. They added a fellowship hall later on, and East Norway Lake has been a compatible partner with First Lutheran for the past 50 years. In February of 2004, Reverend Wayne Kapitsky and Donna Jo Kapitsky, AIM, were installed. Under the leadership of Pastor Kapitsky, the Norway Lake Parish consists of two vibrant congregations who continue serving its membership and reaching out to the Norway Lake community and beyond. Various joint committees and organizations are actively functioning within the Norway Lake Parish, while some function independently. The Norway Lake Lutheran Parish has a mission statement which states, "To joyfully celebrate God's love in Jesus Christ by reaching out to all in worship, service, fellowship, and lifelong learning." The Norway Lake Parish also has a neat website, and that can be found at www.norwaylakeparish.org. And now a little bit about Munson Lake, which was first known as First West Norway Lake Evangelical Lutheran Church. On January 7th of 1886, there was a meeting held at Eric Paulson's home by a minority of members of the West Norway Lake Lutheran Church, following the predestination controversy that took place within the Norway Lake Parish. Their pastor, Reverend Marcus, with whom the minority remained loyal, had recently died, and they desired to continue as a church. Reverend Rigg, who had served as Reverend Marcus's assistant, was called to be their pastor along with a minority group from East Norway Lake, our First Lutheran. This action coincides time-wise with action taken by the minority from East Norway Lake and concerned the same controversy, including the treatment of Reverend Marcus. That's what I talked about earlier, and Marlon so eloquently described. On October 15th, 1886, this is a repetition, I guess, Pastor Halverson was installed to serve the parish. And that consisted of First East Norway Lake, First West Norway Lake, and the Kirkoven Lutheran churches. So that was a ways away, too, going to Kirkoven by the same pastor, and also South Lake Johanna. No, South Lake Johanna Lutheran Church joined the parish in 1890. That was later. Pastor Halverson served the minority parish until November of 1890. The parish arrangement continued with First Lutheran in South Lake Johanna until 1963, when First Lutheran voted to sever their ties with Munson Lake and South Lake Johanna. At that time, which we talked about earlier, First Lutheran realigned with East Norway Lake to form the new parish. Kirkhoven Lutheran had earlier left the parish. Individuals involved with the organization of Munson Lake included Bendixson, Noos, Heisted, Paulson, Sicey, Ellisted, Kwame, Ellingbo, Gandrud, Dale, Lesteberg, Evenson, and Berg. Many of the original founding members' family names could be found in the membership lists for several decades thereafter. In 1889, Johannes Halverson was married to Bertha Glesney, daughter of Evan Glesney. They had a son, Sigrid, who was well known in the Sundberg community. Sigrid had a son, John Victor Halverson, who grew up in Sundberg, became a minister, and later taught at Luther Seminary. From 1887 to 1896, meetings were held at the Sicey home, and his granary was used for worship services. On January 21st, 1891, it was decided to purchase an acre of land from H.B. Johnson and Christian Christensen to build a church. The church was built beginning in the summer of 1892 and completed in 1896. On January 3, 1894, articles of incorporation were accepted under the name of the First Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church of West Norway Lake. The church changed its name to Munson Lake Norwegian Lutheran Church in 1935. The pastors that served from 1890 to 1963, throughout this time, First West Lake Lutheran, or Munson Lake, was served by the same pastor who served First East Norway Lake. Then in 1960, the American Lutheran Church was established with the merger of the Old American Lutheran, the Evangelical Lutheran, and United Evangelical Lutheran Churches. This change was instrumental in realigning local parishes. That's when the Red Book was introduced. From 1963 to 1969, Munson Lake and South Lake Johanna did not have a called and ordained pastor during these years. Several interim pastors served the two congregations on a part-time basis. But during that time, Munson Lake Cemetery Association was incorporated in 1965. And then from 69 to 72, Reverend Boydie served the parish. And in 72, Reverend Milton Olson was called to serve the congregations. The Clarence Gandrud home in Sundberg was purchased as the parsonage. West Lake Lutheran Church joined the parish in 1976. From 1972 to 1986, during these years, membership remained stable at Munson Lake. Organizations within the congregation, including the Women's Group, or the ALCW, the Altar Guild, Sunday School, and Luther League were active. Munson Lake Lutheran celebrated their 100th anniversary in 1986 and published a history book, Sing to the Lord. Due to population decline and economic and landscape changes in recent decades, Munson Lake Lutheran Church membership has been stagnant in growth. The congregation has needed the cooperation of other nearby congregations to continue operation. Munson Lake congregation is presently part of the Ack Parish, which Jane will describe in her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eloise. I have to say this story. I know we're going over too long here, but there's a story about Suttendal and News that Eloise mentioned how they get along well. Well, apparently they had, I've heard that they had a code they both like to fish, and they had a code whereby they used the telephone ringing the bell or whatever to signal. They didn't talk. News knew that if it rang at the parsonage and it was a certain ring or something, that it was Suttendal that wanted to go fishing. So there were party lines in those days. Just to sum up this Kirkestriden business, here's a quote from John Jardy, very short, that kind of hits home for all of us, and it tells you what else happened with other churches. While fisticuffs might have been rare, certain Norwegian congregations suffered wrenching internal strife. The ties of old friendships broke. Remembered a man. Neighbor did not speak to neighbor. The daughter who was married to a member of the other party became a stranger in her father's house. Man and wife turned into dog and cat. I don't know if I ever heard that happening out here, but brothers and sisters were sundered from one another. On the other hand, old enemies became friends and were reconciled only when they found themselves on the same side of the insurmountable fence which had been raised between the anti-Missouri and the Norwegian synods. The dissension within congregations were not isolated instances. 1/3 of the pastors and congregations withdrew from the synod as a result of the conflict. So Norway Lake was one of 1/3 of the pastors. In Minnesota alone, 69 congregations left the synod. More tumultuous conflict occurred in 23 additional Minnesota congregations, which ultimately split apart. One faction remaining in the Norwegian Synod, while the other joined the new anti-Missouri Brotherhood. So, and this is written by John Jardy, who's kind of a authority on Norwegian immigration and so forth. And he did a case study of two churches very close to us, Crow River and Gausdal. Crow River remained with the synod, and was in the majority group, so they stayed in the church. The Gausdal people were the anti-Missourians, which my mother's family came from. They had to move down the road south of Georgeville and build Gausdal Church. So it wasn't just here that it happened. Okay, Jane is our last one, and believe it or not, she's the short-windedest of us all.
It's hard to follow such historians here. Okay, after the split, I'm going to just really focus in on the Westlake. After the split in the Norway Lake congregations, the remaining members of the East and West Norway Lake churches called Reverend R.K. Fjellstein in 1886, who served until September 1st, 1901. During this time period, a faction of the congregation became dissatisfied with his preaching and his ministry. They promoted the preaching of Pastor B.S.J. Sund, who was currently the pastor of the following congregations: Sundberg Free Church, that's north of Sundberg, the Our Saviors at Bruton, and a Belgrade Church, and Crowley Lutheran congregations. This was a proposition that the remaining membership of the East Norway Lake would not tolerate. The results were that this faction then broke off while retaining Pastor Sund, formed their own congregation to the west, namely Westlake Lutheran Congregation. This church was incorporated in November 12, 1903, with the building completed in 1904. One note: I found it interesting that in one history that I wrote, that Pastor Sund was described as a maverick. In the other, he was called more liberal. I don't know which was which. Anyway, the Westlake original congregation consisted of 23 families and 23 men and their families. Of course, men had the vote. Reverend Sund was born March 26, 1862. His obituary gives his full name as Bernt Simon Jensen Sund from Sur-Flatanger, Trondheim, as his birthplace. The 20-year-old Bernt left Norway on May 31st, 1882, aboard the ship called Tasso, bound for Philadelphia via Hull, England. His last He got his last name was Americanized somewhere along the line from Jussund, or Jossund, I think that's how it would be pronounced, to just Sund. Having decided to enter the ministry, he studied theology at Augsburg Seminary, graduating in 1890. I graduated from Augsburg too. Following his ordination, he came to the Norway Lake area to serve as pastor of the Lutheran congregations Crow Lake, Our Savior's at Bruton, Sundberg Free Lutheran. This is also Reverend Sund helped build the church in Belgrade, which now became a property of the German Lutheran congregation. For several years, he was also pastor of churches in Farwell and Lowry, as well as the Gausdal Church near Georgeville. With the addition of Westlake, he served the 4 congregations: Bruton, Crow Lake, the Sundberg Free, and Westlake in a regular way. He died on April 7th, 1936. A note. Historical note. In the early 1900s, because the snowdrifts were just 10 feet high, there was no snow blowers. BSJ, as he was commonly called, would have to leave Belgrade at 3:30 in the morning with this cutter sleigh to reach Colfax Township, home of his wife's uncle Olaf Olsen, to get fresh horses. He would then continue to Sundberg Lutheran Church for morning services and then to Westlake Church for the afternoon service. He would then head back to Olsen's, where he would spend the night. He would make the trip back home the next day. Reverend Bodin was born in Bode, in the church district of Bodin, which is in the Nordland commune, on September 12, 1885. On May 14, 1902, he boarded the second ship named Tasso and set sail for Boston via Hull, England. He married Hannah Halverson in December 31st, 1912 at Red Wing, Minnesota, and also completed his education there. He was ordained as a minister on June of 1915 at St. Paul, Minnesota. He served the evangelical Lutheran churches in parishes in Montana, North Dakota, and Idaho before coming to this area. He also served 4 churches at the same time: Westlake Lutheran, Our Savior's Lutheran in Bruton, Crow Lake Lutheran, and Sundberg Free Lutheran. Another note, the 2 pastors, Reverend B.S.J. Sund and Reverend K.A. Bodin, served the Westlake Parish for 63 years. And other than that, they had a number of things in common. First of all, they migrated to America as young men. They were educated in America, and they left on a ship, 2 ships actually, but they both were named Tasso. The other, one 20 years after the other one. They made their way to Minnesota. Both became pastors, served in some of the same churches. Since they were raised in the coastal regions of Norway, they were influenced by the system that had very little liturgy. No robes, no verbal responses except the creed and the Lord's Prayer. And that's the church that I grew up in. After retirement, K.A. Bodin, in 1968, the Westlake Church joined the Free Lutheran Synod together with the Sundberg Free Church. The Crow Lake and Bruton churches by that time were closed. Westlake congregation approached the Munson Lake and South Lake Johanna parishes about joining forces to create a 3-point parish in 1976. The Westlake Lutheran Church joined the ALC at that time. Westlake, Munson Lake, and Hope are members of the ACT, the Area Churches Together Parish. This ministry is rooted in the Acts of the Apostles, with 8 mission points spread out on impacting communities in Swift, Kandiyohi, and Chippewa counties in Minnesota. Together, they strive to maintain their respective churches while growing to proclaim the good news of God's grace for all. They are now served by two pastors, Pastor Mari Torkelson and Pastor Dan Kronquist. A historical note. Why was the name chosen Westlake? Of course, we have a lot of lakes, okay? There was a Westlake Creamery and a Westlake Post Office started in 1898 on 1 acre of land on 167th, 62nd, and Candy Swift Road, which is west of your ways. It continued until 1920s when it burned down. That's probably why they chose the name Westlake. It was nearby. On a personal note, I'm always thankful that the folks who settled in this area gave their attention to making sure that the church reflected the gospel as they perceived it. They took the time and the energy to put their stamp on how they perceived what the church should be like. It must be remembered that when we are looking at the conflicts and the disagreements, and be sure there were a lot of them, that it is a sign of the ongoing faith of the church. We received this inheritance from our pioneer men and women. They were not lukewarm. When there are no conflicts, there is no life. There's new life is born out of struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for a very, very fitting conclusion. There's two things I feel I should mention, then we're going to go. But two churches we didn't talk about, one of which is on your diagram. It's Sunburg Free Lutheran, and there's been no ties that we are aware of between Sunburg Free Lutheran and the Norway Lake organization. In fact, so many of the churches we talked about today were connected originally to Lars Marcus, except Westlake, because that happened quite a bit later. But the first pastor at Sunburg Free Lutheran, which is up in kind of in a little wooded area just north of Sunburg on, what's that tar road? 36. So most of you know where it is. First pastor there was Ole Paulson from the Wilmer Conference Church. So that's different from what these churches were. First service was held at Andreas Jurgensen's home in 1874, so that's an old church too. It goes way back. It was called the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church of Sunburg, and the building was begun in 1876. And we know two members that were founding members of that church that were also members at Norway Lake, but we don't know if there's any connection other than that. So that's one reason it's kind of, and it's just like Kurt said today, the history is never finally written. There's always something else that's going to pop up. So anybody knows anything about that one, let us know. Nannested, same thing. Nannested is the one I said was south of 5 and 40, where the cemetery sits today, just south of Jim Thompson's and north of Pierce's there. That was basically Ole Stini was the man who helped start that church, and that also Ole came here in 1867. He was a big advocate of the Hauge Synod. The Hauge Synod was more of a pietistic synod in Norway, and the first cemetery some of the first people that died were buried on Stini's farm, where I suppose it's where Howie Larson lives today. Church was built, the Nannested Church was built in 1879, first named Urland, which was the name of Stini's home in Norway. It was used by the Hauge Synod until 1912. Then it was used by the Church of God for a few years, and it was sold to Oscar Skinlund in 1946 and razed. So some of you may have lumber in a building out there someplace that was part of the Nanisted Church. Not sure. And they were partners with Bethany Lutheran over by Long Lake. If you saw an article in the paper a while back, Leonard Isdahl from Spicer had been remodeling that building and so forth. Well, they were tied in with the Nanisted Church. So just want to let you know that. We're done, I think, aren't we? If there's questions, I think maybe what we should do is just, you can check with us afterwards. We'll be around for a while. I know many of you are anxious to get rolling, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Marlon, and readers. Thanks, Marlon and readers, for a wonderful tour of the church, history of the churches in the area. Where are we at in the program? News from Norway Lake Lutheran Historical Association. First, I should say it is after 3 o'clock. Did we plan coffee here today or not?
Yeah, they've got it.
There's coffee here.
Yeah, lots of.
But I guess we also can have coffee at
Oh, sure.
Or
Or both. You can have it both.
have it both places. Yeah. So news from the Norway Lake Historical Association. I think we've had a good year so far. Our Vesper services have gone very well this year. We're done with them for the year, but attendance has been quite good. I think we must have averaged over 30, probably. I haven't figured out the average yet, but it's been very good. We started on a couple of new projects that are probably going to take a few years, and that is we'd like to work up short biographies of all the charter members in the different churches. And we have a good list of the charter members in the West Norway Lake and the East Norway Lake. So that's a good place to start. And I have about 4 people have contacted me and offered to help. And so we're starting to move on it, but I just want to collect information, find out where they're born. Many of them are immigrants, of course, when they came, what they did here, where they settled, and such. So that's going to be a project that I'd be interested in over the next few years. Another one is to find out, we mentioned 77 burials from this church. I mean, that's what you said, 77 from the Law Church before the formation of the 2 daughter churches. It would be great to know how many people were buried on this ground that we stand on, and what their names were. To do that, we first have to get a list of those people who died in those years. So that's a challenge. But I think if we do our best and work at it, we'll learn a lot. We may not find everything, but we should learn a lot. And I think we're prepared to spend a few years working on that. We mentioned that there's a book that you heard about already. This one was, the copyright was 1976. Joel News wrote this book. It's by his father.
Yes.
And
Roseau County.
and we republished the book in 2009. Printed extra copies. We still have copies, and you can have it for $5 now if you're interested. So we have several copies here. We have some refrigerator magnets, very pretty drawing of the old log church, original log church, $1 up here. Are we prepared to do an offering? Yeah. Prepared for that? Okay. We'll do that, and Gene, have you got some music that you can... All right, thank you.
There is a Redeemer.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the concluding hymn, the next couple of events to finish out the year for us is we will have Lefse Day, and that will be in October. Would it be the 10th of October? The second Saturday? Ed, is Ed here? He knows.
Good enough.
Lefse Day, October 10th, the second Saturday in October. And there will be an opportunity to learn how to make lefse and then sample it. And it'll be done at the Knutson cabin.
That's right.
And we hope for good weather. And after that, there will be the Advent service here, or the which is the first Sunday after Advent. Who has the date for that? You know the date? Is it November 29th?
Mom's right.
Probably about that, but anyway, you'll be hearing about it. So those are the next two events for us. Then we come then to the concluding hymn, Rock of Ages, should be in your song sheet. Well, thank you very much for coming out and braving the weather here. It's very cozy under the tent as the rain was falling on the tent. Only the lady in the back on the back of her head and on the back of her dress there. But anything else we need to say? Marlon, said everything today?
That's enough.
That's enough. Very good. So let's adjourn and have coffee and treats over there, and then go over and see Byron Hogan.
Did it work out?